value I can for you. So what's important to me is that you please feel free to stop me and ask your question midstream, or if you want to hold your questions till later, that's fine. I tend to talk too much, I think, and I don't want to eat up the time that we'll have together at the end for a general Q&A. So if you could keep your eye on the clock for me and just let me know when it's time to stop and go into the next phase, that would help me.
Yeah,
because that now I just got this dialogue box on my thing that says this meeting will be recorded. Okay, I have to hit continue. Okay, so we're recording. So now I have to be really careful about what I say. Okay. First, I just want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to do this with you today, because it's been a wretched, miserable year. And in this total isolation, I know for you and for me, working as an artist by myself, it's been a nightmare. So having this opportunity to see you and connect with you today is really important to me. And I'm really grateful for this. So thank you.
well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, honestly, in a similar way, thank you so much for being willing to just do this with us and connect to us in the same way, just because I feel like it's nice that people are still willing to reach out and talk to each other.
Well, we're all we've got, you
Mhm.
know. I mean, I think that we've managed to survive all of these millennia by being tribal, and I think this pandemic has highlighted the fact that how much we really need each other, you know. So at what point do you put up the PowerPoint, or are you seeing it at this point? Where is
I'm
that?
going to put it up for you right now.
Okay. Good. So give me a moment to just, oh, okay, that's cool. Good.
There we
That's
go.
cool. Okay. And good. So that's what I'm seeing on my side now. So I'm just gonna get started here. So in the studio one day, I'd been in the studio for a few years, and in a fit of passion, in emotion, I turned to my father and I said, oh, you've given me this opportunity to have this wonderful life and go around the world and learn all these skills, and how can I ever repay you? And he said, you can't. But what you can do is when those sparklers come through your life and your studio, and you'll know them, you teach them. And that's been a golden thread throughout my life. And that very much feels like what our time together today is. Oh, good. That worked. Go to the next slide. So I just want to spend a moment on my roots with you, because I think that's important to put where I'm at in context. So my father, Bruce Hoheb, was this New York City guy, and he grew up in New York, and he went to Columbia University, and he studied pre-med for a while, and he studied civil engineering, which is where he got his degree at Columbia in civil engineering. And he married my mother, and he got completely absorbed into this Italian mafia family's construction business, which built half of Long Island City in New York. And during that time, in the 1950s, my father's passion for sculpture, specifically stone carving, was absolutely not taken seriously by this Italian family. In fact, my father told me a story one day that the godfather in the family said of my father's passion for carving stone, he said, breaking rocks, that's what they do in prison. So you can imagine my poor father, knowing that they weren't taking his artwork seriously, he joined the family's construction business, and he quickly went through the ranks of bricklayer to foreman to master construction foreman, but always during those, what he called stolen moments, he would go up to the Art Students League in New York City, and he would practice drawing and sculpture and, next slide. Can you do the next slide? Okay, we'll stay on that for a minute. So he practiced his passion for stone carving, and these were his stolen moments. And during that time at the Art Students League, this old timer took him under his wing, and he told my father about the old-fashioned, time-honored tradition of three-dimensional sculptural enlarging, which is the blowing up of an artist's work to heroic or monumental proportions. And this has been done since day one. It was always done by other technicians behind the scenes. And the guy told my father that if he had the ego, the discipline of ego, to work on someone else's work, that he would learn a huge amount, that he referred to this as being in the allied trades. And he said, you know, Hoheb, you've got a good eye for modeling. Form is form. And while you're working on other people's work, it's like a pianist playing the scales all day. When you go into your studio, at the end of the day, you will have arrived. You can go to the next slide. You will have arrived. You will have been busy working on other people's work, but in the meantime, you're training your hands and your eye all day long. Form is form. So my father went to the local shop of a sculptural enlarger. He looked at the guy's setup. He went home and he built his own three-dimensional pantograph machine and started small jobs for the local foundries. And over time, the jobs came in from the local foundries, and my father found himself out of construction and into the world of the allied trades of making sculpture for other artists, because he was able to separate his ego of his own sculpture work and be able to work on other people's work. And that old timer's name was Jacques Lipschitz. And it proved to be very good advice. Next slide, please. So I grew up in the studio, but what happened was, and I'm going to share this story with you because it's not something I'm particularly proud of, but I just want to impress upon you the opportunity that I had and how it changed my life. I was 17 years old. I was bored in school. I was doing well academically, but it was the late 60s, early 70s. There was a lot of stuff going on in the street. I'm sorry, I'll turn off my phone. Actually, I'm just getting a text from my sister, and I'm going to give her the password. Okay, so she can join us, my PhD, excuse me. See if that works for her. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was 17 years old and I wanted to quit school. And my parents were hysterical. And there was a lot of discussion, and my parents knew me enough to know that if they didn't fill out the papers and give me permission, I was 17, I couldn't just walk out the door, that I would walk out the door anyway. So my father said, okay, so let me get this straight. You're 17 years old, you're a woman, and you're about to leave education and go out into this man's world. And you're going to go out there as a woman with no skills and no formal education. And what's going to happen is that you are going to become a slave to every man that goes through your life, whether they're your husband or a boss, you're going to be their slave. He said, why don't you come into the studio with me? I mean, I need the help. And I was thrilled. I'd always loved the mess and the jumble of it because I'd been in there as a kid. And so that's what I did. So when I was 17 years old, I started my formal apprenticeship in my father's sculpture studio in New York. And it would be, at the time, I was thrilled because all I knew was like a get out of jail free card, right? And it would be many, many years before the wisdom of that advice really settled on me. So it began, my formal apprenticeship in mold making and casting and enlarging, and I loved it. I loved the mess of the studio. I loved organizing. I loved all the mundane tasks, the repetitive tasks of processing the clay and making shadow boards for the tools. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And the real key, and the reason I'm even here to talk to you today, is because I had the power of this great teacher and this mentor who taught me these skills. And since I was there, I happened to be a girl. It didn't matter to my father. The work had to be done. If the floor needed to be swept, if the buckets had to be cleaned, if the 50-pound bags of plaster had to be moved, I was it. So he said, don't ever lift anything that's over 70 pounds. You know, women can get hernias just the same as men. He taught me how to lift. He taught me all of these things over time. The teaching was relentless. The teaching never stopped. When I look at this picture, I'm reminded one day of, it was a warm summer day and my father was out of the studio, and Giuseppe, the Italian plaster delivery guy, came to the studio in his truck, and he was delivering a ton of plaster. And a ton of plaster is, they're 50-pound bags, and there were 40 bags, and the task was to move them from the truck to the other side of the studio. And Giuseppe hoisted a bag on his shoulder, and he marched across the studio and put it on the pallet. And I went up to the truck, and I put it on my shoulder, and I walked across because I had other work to do. We wanted to get this done. Let's go. And Giuseppe turned to me and he said, "Oh, a little girl, you can't do that. You know what you can do? You can go in the house and make me a nice glass of iced tea." Thinking about a lesson my father taught me, I said, okay. So I went in the house, I made 2 glasses of iced tea. And I watched Giuseppe sweat his cojones off. And when he was done and he went away, I remember my father always saying, you don't have to show those boys how strong you are. You step back and think of your next move. So in and out of all of these years of being in the studio together, the lessons never stopped. And these are some things that I want to share with you today. I mean, I was really proud of my strength. When I was 17, 18, 19, 20, I was really strong and really proud of it. And I like to show off a little time, but he always said, you don't have to show, you don't show off. You step back and think of your next move. A major job, next slide. A major job that we were entrusted with was the enlargement of a series of sculptures by William de Kooning. And these little bronzes that you're looking at are only 6 inches tall. There were 3 of these bronzes that de Kooning's friend Henry Moore had always told him these pieces should be made to heroic scale. And they sat on a shelf for like 30, 40 years. And when it was decided that they would be enlarged and translated into bronze, next slide, they came to our studio for this task. I'm holding in my hand the small model, the original model. And then because the change in scale was so enormous, it was a 16 times enlargement, I did it in 2 stages. The intermediary stage, which you see in the front, the white plastic model there, and then the full-size piece, which was enlarged in plastiline. Next slide. So de Kooning was 80 in his 80s at the time, and he was not physically capable of doing this type of modeling on a large scale clay sculpture. So that task was entrusted to us, and it was exciting and it was terrifying. I mean, it was de Kooning, right? And it was our job to not only physically enlarge the pieces, but also do the final modeling, which is a huge responsibility in terms of interpreting the artist's gestures and making it look not mechanical, but essentially understanding how to breathe the life back into it. And we made some mistakes along the way. The first time, next slide, please. The first time de Kooning came to the studio with his wife, Elaine de Kooning, we had worked on the intermediary size piece, and we were so focused on getting it perfect that while it was perfect, it was too perfect, and we kind of missed the underlying energy of the form. And Elaine de Kooning said, you have to think about what de Kooning did. He sat on a park bench in Italy in the 60s and made this quickly out of clay, and there was that energy there, and that's what you need to capture. Because although an enlargement can be perfectly accurate, traditionally the sculptors come back into the enlarged clay size and they model it and then make it their own again. And that was what we had to interpret for de Kooning. So that was terrifying and thrilling, and we just had to learn to loosen up a little bit. But with de Kooning's support and encouragement, it was very successful. Next slide, please. So he would come to the studio. There were 3 sculptures. It was done over a 3-year period. And each time we finished the modeling, next slide, he would come and look at it and approve it. And then we would go on to translating the work from clay into fiberglass, and then bringing the fiberglass pieces to the foundry where they cast the works in bronze over a 3-year period. Next. So this image shows the finished clay at 12 foot tall and the plaster waste mold that I made over it in many, many pieces. I was particularly miserable in that photograph. I didn't want to be in the photograph, and my father said, no, you got to be in the photograph. I need you in there for scale. So that's my scale face, right? Next slide, please. So we made negative plaster molds over the whole sculpture. And what you're looking at here is the negative mold, and we cast fiberglass into it in multiple pieces. Next. And then once all of those pieces were cast, then we put the whole thing together. And then next slide. Then I would bring the fiberglass masters full size to the foundry where they cast them into bronze. Next. So this is a shot at Talek's foundry in Beacon. They had just moved into the big space, and this is the completed bronze. Next. And this is the finished work at de Kooning's studio out in East Hampton. So it was enlarging the pieces was a 3-year process, and in and amongst other work that was going on, but terribly exciting. Next. And a wonderful thing happened along the way. When you make a sculpture, at the end, before it's cast, you have to put the artist's name in it. So I had de Kooning sign this little piece of paper, and then I physically enlarged his signature to scale it up to the sculpture. And then we talked about the dates. He had originally made the piece in 1969, and it was completed as an enlarged version in 1980. So once we got that all sorted out, I engraved that into the clay so that it would go through the different translation processes and end up in the bronze. Next. But when he came to the studio to look at and sign the paper, and we were talking about the inscription information, I turned to Bill and his wife Elaine, and I said, I've looked at the heroic old-fashioned bronzes in parks for many, many years, and I've often seen enlarged by whoever. And would it be okay if I put my name on that because I've done this? And there's a precedence for it. It's an old-fashioned thing to do. You don't see it anymore, but it's been done in history. And Elaine de Kooning turned to me and she said, absolutely, but I don't want you to put V Hoheb on it. I don't want anybody to think it was some man that did this enlarging. I don't want them to think it was like Victor Hoheb. I was like, wonderful. Okay, but my father and I put Hoheb Studios because, of course, we collaborated with each other. We collaborated with de Kooning, and we collaborated with our many assistants. So that was a really wonderful thing that happened. So I wanted to share that with you. And all of the bronzes, I think there were 3 sculptures. They were enlarged, and I think the addition of each of the heroic pieces were 7. They've gone all over the world. So in Rotterdam, there's this wonderful de Kooning enlargement, and anybody that's interested to see will look at his name, and around the side it says enlarged by Hoheb Studios, New York. So I'm proud of that and grateful to Elaine de Kooning for speaking up. Next. This little sculpture is by Louise Nevelson. She called it Female Figure with Star. She brought me the sculpture, and the task was to enlarge this from 27 inches to 6 feet tall. And ultimately, she didn't want it to go into bronze, but she wanted it to go into black fiberglass. And then she wanted to have little wheels put underneath so she could wheel it around her studio. And that was terrific. So in other words, it was a one-off thing. It wasn't a bronze edition. But once again, Louise, here I am working for an artist who's well into their 80s. And it was understood that we would not only enlarge the piece, but then once she saw it, we would do the final modeling, which meant reproducing all of these wonderful textures that you see in this tiny image on the surface of the clay. She'd made it by hand. It was terracotta. And she had pressed her fingers into it and made all the edges wrinkly, and there was a wonderful burlap texture to it. It had a very wonderful hand-hewn quality to it. Next. While she was at the studio explaining what she wanted, she looked around. She wanted to make a little drawing, and I just looked at the vast expanse of the studio plasterboard wall, and I handed her a pencil, and she drew this picture of the figure, and she pointed out certain things, and we were talking about it. And when we were done, I looked at her and said, "Would you sign that?" So she signed it, Self-Portrait Nevelson. And I just have to tell you that years later, when my father and I moved studios, I took a Sawzall and I cut that out of the wall. And I have it with me to this day. Of course, I replaced the plasterboard hole in the wall so the landlord wouldn't charge us through the nose, but it's just a wonderful artifact. Next. So I was totally into this job. It was totally fun. I was working for Louise Nevelson. I hand-carved tools that would allow me to imitate the texture on the enlarged scale, particularly this little roller in the front. That when I roll that over the clay, it gave me this wonderful burlap texture. And I had a great time with it. It was fabulous. Next. So I put the clay sculpture in the back of my pickup truck, and I drove it down to Louise's studio down in Soho, and she loved it. And she said, "Fabulous, it's perfect, I love it, fabulous. Now, I want you to take it back to your studio and change it. It's a different sculpture. The original was 27 inches tall. This is now 6 feet tall. It's a different piece. I want you to take all this texture out make the surfaces relatively smooth, make the edges very crisp. I want it to look as though it were made out of rough-hewn granite and assembled and then slightly dropped. And I said, okay. I understood my instructions. I thought, I knew I understood my instructions. So I brought the piece back into the studio and I set it up and I literally started tearing the surface apart, redoing all these planes, bringing them to true, doing all this stuff. And a few hours went by and my father came up behind me and he tapped me on the shoulder and he said, Vanessa, I think you need to go out and have a cup of coffee. And when you come back in the studio and you hang up your coat, hang your ego up on the hook next to it. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, I've been watching you for 3 hours and you've got smoke coming out of your ears. He said, you did this fabulous job. The artist loved it. It was perfect. And she asked you to change it. And you're struggling with that. Now, by then I'd been in the studio for years and I always knew that my role was to have no fingerprints, to translate the work of an artist under their direction. That was the discipline of my ego, that this was a lesson I knew. But this time I got so caught up in the fun of it and the pride of it and the excellence of my work that I lost sight of that line. And I show you this sculpture because this was probably one of the most important lessons that I'd learned. And again, it was a lesson I already knew, but emotionally I forgot. And it can happen at any time. And I'm always very aware of it. So that's a biggie. And it really comes under the heading of the discipline of ego. And it's something that you have to be very honest with yourself about if you decide to be a studio assistant. It's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to make a living, because people say, well, how do you make a living in the arts? And I think the short answer is you don't. But if you love this work and you want to be around it, it's a lot better to work for an artist or an art-based company than it is to work for McDonald's, because the advantages are profound. If you'll be networking with other artists, you'll be learning new skills, you'll be open to opportunities. But you have to be very honest with yourself in terms of where your ego is. And it's not a judgment on you. If you can put your ego to the side and you make your art on your own time when it's time to make your art, and when you're working for other artists, you are just about the pianist playing the scales all day and practicing, teaching your eye to do what your hands need and vice versa, so that when it's time to make your own art, you will have arrived. So if you think about your own personality and where your ego is, working for an artist can be a wonderful thing. If you know yourself enough to know that that's not your bag, again, it's not a judgment. So you pay the bills by working in a completely different, completely unrelated field. From my experience, what you have to gain by being able to work for other artists is profoundly better than doing something where you have to completely emotionally divorce yourself from your life in the arts, whether it's art history or digital arts or visual arts or anything like that. So you have to really think about what's important to you and what you're interested in and where your ego is. It's not for everybody. Next. So this is just a fun thing in our time together today. It's not every day that you get to see these behind the scenes of the restoration of the Statue of Liberty. And I was my father and I were called upon to help in the restoration. It was 1985. It was the summer before the 100th birthday of the unveiling of the restored sculpture. And there was construction on every aspect, from the engineering to the base, to the grounds, to the surface of the sculpture. And that's where our studio came in. Next. We were called upon to make molds over the areas of the outer skin of the sculpture where holes had punctured the surface. 100 years in the New York Harbor, many people are not aware of the fact that the sculpture is made out of hammered copper, known as repoussé. And the hammered copper skin, the sculpture surface that we see, is the thickness of a US penny. True. And this sculpture surface is supported by an internal scaffold of piping and steel armature. And over 100 years in the marine environment of New York Harbor, water collects in the low spots and punctured a hole in it. So part of the restoration of the Statue of Liberty was to repair these holes. Next. And what that meant was going up 300 feet in the air on the scaffold and making molds over the area. There were 5 or 6 spots where there were holes. And our specific job was to make a hole over, make a repair on the tip of the nose. There was a curl of hair around the back, a corner of the eye, and a little fold in the back. So what we did was we made molds over these areas. We brought the molds back to our studio in New York City. We made plaster casts. Then we made new molds made of urethane, and we gave those urethane molds to the coppersmiths who hammered pieces of copper into these urethane molds and then replaced them. So that was our job, and it was next. It was an absolute thrill of my life to be up on the scaffold on a all my life I've seen the Statue of Liberty, but I'd never gone there. And to be picked up every morning by Coast Guard cutter to go to work was a thrill. And to see the city from that vantage point was a thrill. And to see the sculpture that close, I knew it was an opportunity of a lifetime. And no, I'm not afraid of heights. So we closed our shop for the week, and we set up our shop at the Statue of Liberty. And what you're looking at here was we made painted rubber molds over each of these spots. Next. And we painted rubber and then made supportive plaster jackets. Next. And then we took the molds apart. And as I said before, we brought these molds back to our studio where we cast them in plaster and then brought the work to the coppersmiths. So this shot that was in Scientific American, I think, this composite image, this kind of shows the whole process, making the mold, the coppersmiths cut out the bad bit, and then the orange, the curl of the hair in the lower is the raw copper, which was then later patinaed or chemically colored to match the original. And the question came up in all the interviews and press that surrounded this historic restoration is, we're paying all this money, how come we're not getting a shiny new statue? And the answer is that you don't want that. Copper oxidizes, and the green blue color that we're also used to seeing on rooftops and architectural elements is it stops. It forms a self-skinning membrane, and it reaches a point of stability. So this green patina that you see, which is actually an oxide, is a protective layer. So I wanted to share this with you because it was, to this day, probably the biggest thrill of my life. One day I was working on the scaffold and I heard this noise, and it was a and I realized that it was the Goodyear blimp, but it was below me. And I actually waved at the people in the little gondola, and they waved back, and I just thought, oh my God. So that's what I wanted to show you. This next shot and this last shot of this series is at the end of the day, we would wait for the Coast Guard cutter to come back and pick us up and take us home. And that's this eye mold. And I just thought that was a really great thing. So then jumping ahead a bunch of years, I just wanted to show you briefly the work of Frank Stella, who I worked with to this day. And Frank Stella, at almost 80 years old, was the first artist that I was aware of who was working with the digital technologies that had kind of exploded onto the scene. Now, this was in the 80s. And Frank was one of the first guys that I knew to incorporate this work. We take three-dimensional modeling programs that in turn program the rapid prototyping processes through milling machines, water jet cutting, laser cutting, three-dimensional printing, stereolithography printing, metal sintering printing. I'm throwing all this stuff out to you because I know that many of you are in the digital arts, and these are the tools that sculptors are using today. And there is a really important place for you in their studios as an assistant, organizing these processes and vendors and new, the technology is changing faster than we can blink. By the time we're done today, there'll be another tool in the bag for them to use. And that's where you could very well come in. I kind of had to learn about this by rote because I obviously was very old school stuff. Next slide. And so I learned about the processes when Frank said to me, oh, well, I'm going to enlarge this sculpture, but you don't have to make that aspect of it for me. I'm going to have it digitally printed. And I was like, okay. So working with him, for him, next, he taught me a tremendous amount. And again, it was a tremendous collaboration. But the digital technologies have opened up a whole new vocabulary for artists. Next, to use. This large-scale sculpture that Frank enlarged from a small paper model, he did the digital printing. I did the textural forms on that blue element. I made it out of paper mache because he just gave me a vague thing of, I want it to look like this or that. And I made up a sample and said, is that okay? And he said, I love it. So I did the hand work, and he had his fabricators do the water jet cutting and the folding and the fabrication, and then he would paint them. So it really always comes down to collaboration. Here's a close-up, next close-up of that texture. Artists are always pushing the boundaries. And again, the digital technologies, this is an airport seating piece by Zaha Hadid, the wonderful architect who we lost a few years ago. She imagined this piece, and then her studio developed it in a three-dimensional modeling program. And then the sculpture itself was milled out of foam at full scale. Then it was given to me, and with the foundry's help, we cast it in aluminum. Next. Let's see. This is an example of, this is an actual physical piece that was printed on a rapid prototyping machine made out of sintered copper. Extraordinary process. Next. Frank Benson is a Brooklyn-based guy, and his work is incorporated from old school to new school. Frank scanned the full-size figure of a performance artist named Juliana Huxtable, a poet and a musician and a performer who's based in Brooklyn. And then from that scan data, Frank manipulated it to suit his own aesthetic. And the figures on the top are printed as a stereolithography, three-dimensional hollow pattern, which can be cast directly into bronze. And the figures below, the head and the the details of the genitalia and the braids were done as a wax print. Next. And then that's a detail of that wax print. If you can, doesn't take much, you can see the striations from the printing, from the 3D printer. And that was part of Frank's aesthetic. It was a very considered decision on his part to leave those lines in, which when you look at the next piece, although the next slide, you can't see the details of that in this image, but they are there. So once all of those pieces were cast in bronze, at the foundry, we welded everything together. Next. And then ultimately it was painted in an architectural grade. Next, paint. And that's the finished work. So it's an incredible array of tools that artists have available to them now. And where you come in as how do you make yourself valuable is you can go from old school, learning how to, people are still using plaster, they're still getting their stuff up in space in the form of rough maquettes, and they're going all the way through you incorporating the digital technologies. So there's lots of room for help. They need help. This romantic view of an artist working by themselves in the studio all day is just that. It's a romantic view. I mean, there are times to work alone, and more often than not, artists need help on every level, which is how that's kind of where I think you come in. Next. So I just want you to take a minute and read this and focus on the last line. I have this little postcard stuck on my studio wall, and I put a thumbtack in it, and it's stuck on the wall at a rakish angle. But that last line has guided me through my life. Excellence in any branch of life implies voluntary exertion. It's about that little extra bit, what I call the 2% factor. Like the difference between good and excellent is sometimes just that little bit of finesse, refinement, effort, thought that you put into the task at hand. Working with other people, working with artists, communication never gets easier. Never. And you have to listen and understand what somebody's version, when they say what I call the dreaded P word, perfect, when they use that word perfect, it's like, uh-oh, are we talking Jeff Koons perfect? Are we talking, what does that mean to you as the artist, perfect? I mean, to me, when I hear the word perfect, I think I have this visual of standing on a mountaintop on one foot with a really strong wind blowing. That's like, and it's this moment that you achieve perfection, and it's very fleeting. Most of the time, when you're really paying attention and you're doing the best work you can, we occupy that ledge right below it, which I think of as really fucking good. And you have to know when does something have to be perfect? Because I really kind of save that for the people at NASA. And when is really effing good the go? And that requires communication and listening. And for all my talking and blabbing, I spend a lot of time I shut up and listen to understand what the artist or the client needs, and then make sure that I repeat it so that we're clear. I mean, if somebody's paying you to make a Rolls Royce, you make a Rolls Royce. If they're paying you to make a Chevy, you make a good goddamn Chevy. But you have to understand what their expectations are. And not everything can be a jewel because you go out of business. If somebody's paying you for a great Chevy and you've quoted a job or you've estimated how much it's going to cost and you put in extra hours and you make a Rolls Royce, well, okay, but you're going to go out of business pretty soon. And then there are times when someone's given you the task of making a really great, they're paying you to make a great Chevy, but they're expecting a Rolls Royce, and you got to just eat it and make the Rolls Royce. So it's a constantly changing landscape, and it's never crystal clear because not everybody's a great communicator, and many artists are horrible at that. So it's kind of up to you to say the words and get a clear understanding of what's expected. But when I
Vanessa,
think,
I'm
yes,
just gonna pop in real quick and just let you know we have 20 minutes
great,
left.
good.
But I thought that was a
Thank
great
you.
moment. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think about lessons along the way. Let's go to the next slide. And I think about the lessons of quality, of integrity, and trust. And it's those concepts that I think of as the golden thread. And it's those qualities are what enabled me when I came up with the idea of making the American Artists Hand Archive, of recording the makers of our time and casting them into bronze, of being able to pick up the phone and calling Jasper Johns and saying, Jasper, I have this idea and I'd like to record your hand to go into bronze as part of a larger archive, that he said, I'd be delighted. So we can go through these images just as I talk. You can go through these images randomly as you're interested, and I'll just finish up my talk here. When I think about quality, I always think about the bumper sticker of, do I have to fill this hole? And what I mean by that is, one day I made this fabulous sculpture, very detailed thing, and I looked at it and I said to my father, do I have to fill this hole? And he looked at it and he said, can you see the hole? And I said, yeah. And he slapped me on the back of the head and he said, then fill the hole. Don't ever think that you're the only craftsman on the block. If you can see the hole, somebody else can see the hole. Fill the hole. So that little bumper sticker has guided me through many times in the middle of the night when I was thought, oh, am I done? Is it over? Is it good enough? I filled the hole. And the integrity part comes in terms of, hey, look at this guy. You know this guy. That's our guy, right? Professor Smith, we miss you today, but he'll be back. The integrity part comes in and you have to stand behind your work. When a mistake is made, you have to stand behind your work. You have to make it right. I'm going to paraphrase Maya Angelou here, who said, people will forget what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel. So if a job is going south or going bad, or it's getting screwed up and you have to be late, you pick up the phone and you let them know. And then when you do show up with this job that's fabulous, that's what they remember. They're not going to remember that it was a day or a week or a month late. Of course, unless you miss a show, then they're going to hate you forever. But within reason, they'll remember when it was fabulous work. And they'll keep coming back. And when you pick up the phone and say, Ed, can I mold your hands for the American Artists Hands Archive? He'll say, I'd be delighted. And it's that trust that I built this part of my life on. And it's very meaningful work to me. One last thing, and then we're going to turn it back over to you. I wanted to just talk to you about collaboration, because there are many times when it's important and necessary to work alone. But the idea of collaboration, where you can draw on other people's skills, is invaluable. And if you find yourself in the wonderful position of being the orchestra leader to assembling a team, things that I've really learned, sometimes often the hard way along the way, is that you need to let people shine where they shine. No one is perfect. No one is everything. No one has all the skills. That everybody has a little piece of the pie. So when you're assembling a team, drawing on other people's skills to do a task, you want to remember that you don't be angry at your compressor because it's not a bandsaw. Let people shine where they shine, and don't set them up for failure. Set them up for some success. Don't ask them to do something that's out of their zone, but you, as the orchestrator of that, will choose those people whose skills will come to the top. In other words, you surround yourself with people that are better than you or as good, so that you all grow and learn. And this collaboration, that's been like the essence of my life in working with these incredible artists. And it's been the joy of my life. So, one more thing, then the biggest asset that you have, thank you. The biggest asset that you have on your side right now is time. You have time to go down different paths. I don't think there are any wrong paths, because you learn something about yourself. You learn as you go. How do you know you don't like broccoli if you don't eat it? How do you know, it's not wasted time. It's not wasted effort. There's a term in Italian, derobare dei mestieri. You steal the mysteries and you make them your own. So when you're offered a job doing this or a job doing that, as out of your zone you might think it is, take the time, take the opportunity and give it a try. Later on, that'll become a tool in the bag. And at this point in your 20s, you have that luxury of exploring. I know one of you told me you were going to be taking a gap year. Fabulous. So it goes along those lines. So these are some of the things I wanted to share with you, and I'm going to stop talking for a few minutes and let you talk.
Thank you, Vanessa. So if anyone has any questions that they want to jump right into, feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, we'll be selfish and choose our own questions first. So go ahead.
Vanessa, has there been any time where there has maybe been a hardship in your life where you relied on your work to like maybe help you through that? Like, has there any been like I'm really into art therapy. So as like a professional artist, has there been any time where your work has really helped you through a tough time?
Right now,
I agree.
This pandemic has overturned our world, turned us inside out. And I am so grateful to the artists who've managed to keep making art, because I feel like it's the only thing to hang on to. And I'm so grateful to those people who are making films and music and theater and dance, because we as a culture, this is what fills our jug. This is what has us connected. So that's been a constant in my life. But right now, I feel like we have that in spades. Are you sensing that? I mean, are you drawing on sources of videos and Zoom meetings and Instagram and things to fill your jug, to know that there are extraordinary people out there doing extraordinary work?
Yeah,
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
without a doubt, that's all that's really been getting us along, I think.
Yeah, and for the civilians, by that I mean the people who are not in the art world, many of them don't realize how much they're surrounded by music and theater and dance and murals in outdoor spaces and green spaces that have all been designed by artists. And maybe they don't realize, because they take it for granted, as we've all done, how much this fills the jug and how much it nourishes us. So when I think about your profession, a profession of art therapy, I mean, that's combining the best of the best in terms of giving people from all walks of life a tool to navigate through, to remind them music, film, the goodness, the color that you paint a wall affects us emotionally. So I tip my hat to you, Sarah, for
you.
this work.
If I can ask my question now, sorry, I didn't know if that was like done or if
Oh,
that
I'll
was
do
like
it.
Amelia, you're good.
pause. Or
Amelia, hi.
just wanted to make sure I wasn't like cutting anyone off. But I'm actually really interested in your American Hands artist hand archive, and just sort of the way that you're literally taking the tools with which an artist like creates things and using that as sort of the preservation to sort of remember. And that's just so amazing to me that like you thought of that and just did that. So I was sort of wondering if you could, you would be willing to sort of elaborate a bit about how you first sort of came upon the idea, and then
sure.
sort of the process of really, yeah.
Sure. I mean, this, one day in the studio, my father and I were just messing around, and he stuck his big, massive stone carver's paw into a bucket of alginate. Do you know alginate, that stuff? It's a quick
Yep.
translation thing. He stuck his hand in, pulled it out, poured a wax in, and he cast a bronze of this massive, like this, massive arthritic thing. And cast it in bronze, and as would be his way, it ended up in a bucket underneath the bench in the studio for 1,000,000 years. And after he died and I was tidying everything up, I came across this beautiful thing, and I brought it home to my studio, and I put a patina on it, and I had it on my workbenches all of these years. And every day I looked at it, and it slowly dawned on me how much this meant to me, to have this physical record of this hand that represented knowledge and power and teaching and learning, and concurrently always working with artists. One of the main things we always talk about is our pain, our arthritis, the broken thumb, the missing bits. They all had war stories. I have my own. Jasper Johns and I would do this work together, and invariably at the end of every work session, we'd share a cup of jasmine tea and we would talk about our arthritis. And I started thinking about all of these incredible makers, physical makers, not the conceptual artists, but the physical makers whose hands bore witness to their process, whether they were a ceramist or a wood carver or a weaver or whatever. They all had missing bits and dings and things, and these wonderful gnarled hands that showed the relationship of the materials that they chose to their process. And I thought, these should be recorded, because I knew how much my father's hand meant to me. So I said to Jasper, I know it's the work, but the people that know you and love you know your hands. We all know our mother's hands, our father's hands. They are as unique as our faces. And he just simply said, great idea. And I said, I wanted to record as many of the great makers of our time, and I think that they should be part of a collection. Ultimately, I'd like to get this into the Smithsonian or the National Archives as part of their permanent collection. So I just literally picked up the phone and called these artists, and every single one of them, their response was the same. I'd be delighted. In fact, Beverly Pepper said to me, I do everything with my hands. I cook, I sew, I weld, I do everything. No one's ever asked me to do this before. What can I do to help you? And I just said, Beverly, I just need you to sit still for like a half an hour. And the position that she chose was hers. The other part of this is that I ask the artists to choose a gesture that's interesting to them. And sometimes months of thinking go into it. And sometimes it's very impromptu. Sometimes it's one hand. Sometimes it's two. Sometimes they hold a tool. That's my problem as a mold maker, to do this. And so it's been going on for 10 years. And throughout these years, I've pretty much bankrolled it myself. I did get a Rockefeller Brothers Fund grant last year. And every year I apply for the different grants, and every year other people get them. And my dear friend Eric Fischel, who's been a great supporter, says, just keep applying. After a while, they're going to say, Vanessa Hoheb, just fucking give it to her. So I just, every year when I get the Dear John letter, I just go back and I apply, and then I just get back to my work. But that's the genesis of it. And to me, it's sort of the culmination of my life's work as a technician in the arts, because to have this document that belongs in a museum and hopefully another edition that will travel around, I think it's a really important document. So I appreciate your words. The work is very meaningful to me.
Thank you for speaking about that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Does anyone else have a question? Go ahead.
Maggie?
Sure. I would love to know more about your experience as a woman in the art world. I know you said that story about the iced tea, and I was wondering, like, how has that evolved throughout your lifetime? Because I'm sure you've seen a lot of change with the perspective over the years.
Yeah. As I said, growing up in the studio, the work had to be done with what had to be done. So there was no distinction there between who's the guy and who's the gal. And it was when I think back about the time in the 60s and 70s and my father's teaching to me and how bohemian it was at the time, even with the women's movement just kind of getting wind under their wings, this was still very unusual. And he often said to me, you have a couple of strikes against you. You're a woman in a man's field. You're a young woman, and you are going to have to work harder to get to the same place that a man would get to. So you have to be really confident of your skills, and you have to be doubly confident of what's coming out of your mouth when you open your mouth, because you'll be judged more harshly, which was pretty extraordinary advice when you think about it 40 years ago. I think in the last 10 years or so, that has changed. I haven't seen as many eyebrows go up when I walk into a room of suits on a job, mostly men. I think they're getting used to us. And it also obviously has something to do with my age. I'm 66. I'm 3 times as old as you are. But as a young woman walking into a situation where there were mainly men, it was always, I could tell it was an issue from the sexual jokes, them making passes at me, which I just blew off at the time, to questioning my ability. And I just found that, walking softly and carrying a big stick was my approach then. I just didn't say a lot, didn't flex my muscles too much, but I just worked on the strength, the excellence of my work. But when I look at this now through the eyes of my son, who's 31 years old, and I see his relationships and how he works with women in his business as an engineer, at least through him. And again, my view is quite narrow because I'm not out in the world. I haven't been out in the world in a couple of years now to see how people are interacting with each other. My sense is that this generation and the generation before you have grown up with a different sense of respect and expectation of each other's gender, I think. I need you to tell me more, because my experience is a little different. I mean, here you are, all young women and men in this zone. What are you seeing? Oh, don't all rush to answer at once. It's okay.
Yeah, no, I feel like this is just, we're all sort of thinking about it, because like, it's sort of hard to think of the exact moments, just because I feel like it's more just smaller things that permeate like continuous experiences. Because nowadays people are a lot more, I would say, they're not as outwardly sort of sexist about it, I guess. Just because nowadays people can and will call others out for like the really big stuff. So I feel like it mostly manifests in smaller things where it's
Subtle.
where it's like in it, like I don't know, I like, it's less like specifically art that I can think of, but just tiny stuff where it's like, oh, like the way people sort of, or like teachers or other people will default to being like, oh, something heavy to lift. Well, are there any young men who want to carry these chairs or who want to help with this thing? And it's like, like, and
Yeah.
small stuff like that, where it's not like outwardly super like that, but you sort of think about it in the back of your mind, like, why are you
Amelia, to add on to that, like the subtlety of it, my first like job doing art for money, I was doing like video restoration work, and I was the only female on the team. And even though no one was outwardly, they're very supportive of me, it was kind of the camaraderie of, it was more difficult to be open and be like friendly with people. I always felt like I had to prove myself. And I think having more women in the space and being able to talk about these things, I don't know, I just felt like I became a lot more comfortable in the spaces that were dominated by men when I was able to talk to them about it and be like, hi, I'm uncomfortable in this, like I'm like uncomfortable going to get coffee where everyone's getting coffee or going to lunch because I don't feel like I'm welcome in that space. But being able to have that conversation with my coworkers made it a lot easier for me to go into this.
Yeah, the ubiquitous boys club. But you also have to choose your battles, you know, like when you're, Amelia, when your teacher said, oh, are there any strong young boys around to do this? On one hand, you could just say, well, you know, I'm ready, willing, and able, just to poke fun at them and call them out for the ridiculousness of what they said. On the other hand, you could step back and think of your next move and decide to maybe poke in when you get a real boys club situation. So you have to decide what's important to you. You also have to decide who you're going to poke in the eye and at what time. It's a delicate, ongoing thing. And there was a period of time where I was so oblivious to this and I thought it was a passé. But when I went to Australia, which is about 10 years culturally behind the United States, I saw the sexism in full force there, this very machismo culture. And it took me aback. And boy, they didn't really take kindly to this outspoken Yankee broad. They called me a tall poppy, one that likes to stand above the crowd. And I was like, yeah, and what's your point? You speak Italian? It's tiring. It's tiring. But the tools we have available to us are our colleagues, Jack, our family, anytime you have the opportunity to have these conversations and educate the people around you, you know, it's very overwhelming to try to think that you're going to change the world. So what I've done, especially in the last 5 years with the political nightmare that we've gone through, is I've taken it down to a real local level, and I've tried to impact my sphere, my tribe, my circle, my community. So I try to make those changes and raise my hand and call BS and poke people in the eye in that level, because we can't do it all. We've got work to do. And then hopefully, if you enlighten the guy next to you or the kid on the bus or whoever, then that circle will grow. Otherwise, it's just really depressing and overwhelming. So I'm suggesting small bites. And then sometimes you just got to step back and be loud, you know?
Small ripples make big waves.
every drop raises the pond. I love cliches.
I mean,
I love
honestly, they're cliche for a reason.
exactly. I mean, everybody's got to see the Statue of Liberty. Why? Because, you got to go to the Grand Canyon, right? I just wanted to, when you're really confused and you don't know what to do, start sweeping the floor. Generally, by the time you hit the wall, you're going to have a plan. And if you don't, you have a clean floor. So nothing is wasted.
Yeah.
But I've got this ongoing book in my mind, and I've got a chapter just on bumper stickers. Maybe somebody will call it cliches, but
Love it. So I'm gonna just we don't have to wrap it up right now, but our class period's over, so I imagine some people are gonna be dissipating. But you're more than welcome to hang around. I know I'm going to hang around in case anyone has additional questions, and just to kind of listen to what you have to say. But I wanted to just jump in and kind of sum it up. But we can continue the question round as long as you don't have anything planned and we're not.
I'm very happy to stay here with you. I always, when we're done, I think, oh, I wanted to say, I should have said, so I'm just going to stay here and be quiet and listen, and then take your lead, Sarah, and then we'll do this when it's time. So.
Okay, so if anyone has a class they have to go to, feel free to hop off, but stick around if you'd like to ask questions, and we can just continue on with those now.
I have to go, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for all your expertise and sharing with us today. I thought it was really inspiring and helpful to hear. So thank you.
I hope so. Oh, are you going to be able to join us, Kat, there's a short quiz I prepared.
Oh yeah, everyone's
Just
being
kidding.
graded harshly.
Thank you for your words. I'm glad. I wanted to, how do you share 50 years of a life in an hour? But I just wanted you to know that through Ed and the class and email and Instagram and the social media, I'm just available to you for random stuff at any time. Emails welcome. Again, oh, Dad, how do I pay you back? You don't. This is how I can pay you back. So know that it's an open door.
Thank you.
And I'll send Vanessa's email out to the class after this class session if you guys have questions. And you have to go.
Okay. Thanks, Kat. Take care.
I also have to go. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your wisdom. It means
Sarah.
so much.
You're welcome. I'm really happy to be here today. I feel like it's nice to see humans.
I feel that.
Absolutely.
I also have to leave, but I wanted to say thank you. And I'm so happy we did this on International Women's Day because you're very inspirational.
That's
thank you
right.
for pointing that out.
Thank you for bringing that
you.
up.
Yeah.
Right. When Sarah gave me a choice of 2 days, I chose this because I thought, well, there you go. And it felt right. It felt right.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Mackenzie.
Bye, Mackenzie.
Okay.
Bye. All right. So
I also have to leave, but thank you so much.
You're welcome, Sophie. Okay, bye.
Bye. All right. So does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask? Because I have one. For the Artist Hands Collective, are you going to be doing a mold of your own hands? I'm curious.
Well, maybe. I mean, people have asked me this, but the mission statement for the Artist Hand Archive is to record the makers of our time, whether it's not about fame, although many of these artists are really famous and have contributed extraordinary works, iconic works to American art. So I guess, and it's also about the under-celebrated artists. There are artists in the collection who are not household names. I go back and forth. I all of my life I've worked as a technician and artisan for artists.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until this idea slowly percolated and came to the surface, and even a few years into the generation of the making of these bronzes, that I realized that in this role, I was the artist. Because to me, the difference is art is about the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a new hat that I'm wearing, relatively speaking, going from the artisan to the artist. So in this case, I guess there's no reason that I shouldn't include my hands in this archive. I suppose I should. What do you think? I mean, what do you think?
I would say yes, because your hands are just as part of the process, helping artists kind of create their works in a larger scale, and just all these different materials that they have available to them, because you're part of that like collaborative effort, you're part of the collaboration. So I would be interested in kind of seeing the wear and tear on your hands and like the story of your hands.
They're there.
Because they've been through a lot.
That's also sort of interesting to consider just how many different artworks you've sort of touched and sort of been, your hands have essentially been part of the process of, just because you've mentioned it yourself, you've talked to so many artists and you've worked on so many different works, and your hands sort of in a way reflect that entire sort of
That's true.
way.
It's true. I hadn't thought of it that way before. So I've worked for the last, so I started this 10 years ago, and about 2 or 3 years into it, my dearest friend, Thomas Donahue from Pratt, we met at Pratt Institute, is my artistic director, and he's what I refer to as my next level guy. Whatever idea I have, Thomas always sees the big picture and always just does that 2% factor thing. He takes it from good idea or really good effing idea to perfect. He's my next level guy. So I'm going to be talking with him about this, because people have said to me, oh, this is a term I hate, that, you know what you should do? I just think, no, I'm doing this. You go do that. But anyway,
yeah.
I mean, think about, my world has been with visual artists and artists, but the application for recording the hands of musicians is totally exciting. I mean, could you imagine the hands of Yo-Yo Ma with a fragment of cello in the composition, or a pianist, and so forth and so on. And when I talked about collaboration before, I've collaborated with incredible artisans over 50 years. All of the people at the foundries who were responsible for my American Artist Hands Archive being born, their hands, I look at those. So that's a whole nother category. Where does it end? When I was molding Maya Lin's hands, she said, how many artists do you have on your ongoing list? And I said, well, at this point I have about 26, 28. And she said, you need 50. And I said, right. I mean, it's an ongoing endeavor, money and time, right? So where does it doesn't end, and it won't end. But the idea of incorporating my own hands into this is an interesting concept. So I'll talk to Thomas about this and see. It makes sense when I have an exhibition, had a few exhibitions of it, I always include my father's hands for that very reason, because although he was not known for his sculpture, he was known as a master craftsman. That's the birth of it, and those. So yeah, I guess at this point in my life, my hands have a place there. What a great idea. I'm glad I thought of it. Thank you.
I do have one other question about the hands as well. You've been working on this project for a long time, and I think that's really great. Have you ever considered like the progression of time on artists' hands, how as they age, their hands change, and so does their work?
Absolutely. One of the things that I do when I'm molding their hands, which takes about an hour, when you have these hands that are normally very animated and you're asking them to be still for a period of time, not easy. So just to keep them part of the documentation of the hand archive is I interview them about the life of their hands. Specifically, I ask them if they've ever had an accident or an injury that changed the material that they were working on, either permanently or temporarily, if it opened up avenues, if it was an emotional wall, or if it was freeing somehow. And I just put my little tape recorder on and let the conversation flow as it does. And that documentation in the form of the audio recordings is an important part of this archive, of this documentation. So absolutely the aging and changing of their hands, from being the young, strong wood carver to now an artist of 80, and how that's changed. What tools do they use? How has that changed? That's very much part of the conversation.
Vanessa, I have to hop off into a class, but I just wanted to
Okey
say
doke.
thank you so much. And it
You're
was
welcome,
so nice to
Julia.
get to work with you. Have
Thank
a great
you.
rest of your day. Thanks.
Cross paths again, I
Bye,
hope.
Julia.
Okay.
Alrighty. So we're dwindling off. Anyone else with any ideas or thoughts or questions?
I actually had one quick question.
for it.
Vanessa, for you, how did having a family affect your life as an artist? And like, was it hard to balance that, or?
Yes. Absolutely. When I met my husband and we realized that we were going to have a family, I let this evolve into the birth of our son, because I knew emotionally I had a partner that I can take on this role with this task. My life has always been in the studio. I never wanted to mortgage my time in any way, but having a partner that I knew could shift back and forth to pick up the slack. I knew it was a team effort. And that's why when my son Dana was born, as daunting as it was, I emotionally had this support. And I knew we would be doing this as a team.
Mhm.
But I only had one child for that reason, because I love my time in the studio. And no matter how much auntying or nannying or cousining that you do, no one can ever prepare you for the oomph that is a child. They don't ask to be here. And as a parent, our job is to give them the tools to go through life. And that's a very short time window, to teach them the values and to give them the tools to have a happy and productive life. And after that, they're out the door and on their own. So it's our job to do that, and not a nanny's job and not a TV's job. And I look at people going down the street with 3 children, maybe one on a leash and one in the pram and one in the cooker, and I think, wow, I really hope that was your considered decision, because I know how much time I spent reading to my son, and I couldn't imagine dividing that by 3. And then there are other people like Thomas, my art director, my friend. He came from a family of 9 children and couldn't imagine it any other way. But the life of an artist is unusual, and it's often very solitary, and it's hard because the money's inconsistent and it's a 24/7 kind of thing. So having a child or children, I think it really, I can't imagine it being done without having a partner in the equation to share the load, because no matter what's going on, it changes. And it's the hardest job that you can have, and it's also the most rewarding. But there was a period of time when my father passed away unexpectedly, and we were living in Australia, and I had to jump on a plane and go from Sydney to his home in Oregon and take care of the studio. And I was gone for a month. And when I got on that plane, I had no idea what to expect and how long it was going to take. And my husband, David, who was also working full time as a neon glass bender, and he made the lunches. He got the kid to preschool. He was part of the mommy carpool thing. And that went on for a month. But before Dana was born, we didn't even talk about that understanding that role would be shift as the need came up. But in the early days, my life in the studio started at 9:30 when I dropped him off at preschool, and it came to a screeching halt at 2:30 when I had to stop and go. And it was a drag. I didn't like it. But like time goes fast and things change, and here we are. And I have this wonderful human in my life. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think you did. I just sometimes think about the future. It's like, would you have to put a pause at all? Like when your kid was really young, did you have to take a pause from your studio life?
Yeah, and you can't predict when you can't predict when your child's going to get sick or something serious is going to happen, and then everything stops, because a thing that I would think of to do was like when I would be coming home from wherever I had to come home from, and my mind was racing with the tasks of the day, and I would think, okay, how do I calm down, make this transition? And I thought, you got to take care of the living things first. First there's the kid, then there's the husband, then there's the plants or the dog, and then you got to take care of the living things first. So when you have a child in the equation, depending upon how young they are, and as they go through different things of school, there are pauses. You've got to show up at their school. You've got to show up at their recitals. You've got to be part of their young life. And it's, no one can prepare you for the oomph of that. But if your instincts say, I'm in a situation where I have that kind of support, whether it's a partner or a family, then it doesn't seem so scary. But it's scary anyway.
Thank you.
Child rearing.
I have another question. So I always like to this is like my basic pull out of my pocket question, but what is some advice that your younger self could have used? Something that you know now that might have been good to, like, it'd be good to go back in time and tell your younger self to help them out with this information. What would that information be?
I would have definitely stayed in school. I landed on my feet in the fact that I had a built-in extraordinary teacher. Mm-hmm. My father was a gifted teacher. He could explain the most complex things to me. But over the years, there have been countless times when I have felt the lack of my formal education. So much of what I've learned by rote, by doing, by exposure. And I have felt and feel to this day on the back foot when it comes to certain aspects of that. So I would have done that differently. Mm-hmm. So I think having access to a formal education, a higher education is a tremendous tool, and that just puts wind under your wings.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions as we wrap this up? Any last comments? No.
Not a serious one, but on a sort of more fun note, you mentioned that you went to Australia for a few years. Are there any cool places that you've ever visited or lived that you sort of traveled to around the world?
Around the world? How much time do we have?
Yeah, that is a bit of a loaded question, actually. But sure. Are there any specific places where, if you could say, if you got the chance to go here, where you would be like, sort of like,
sure,
yeah, like where? Sure. What was your favorite place? I guess.
I just saw the Grand Canyon the year before last for the first time. And no matter how many postcards or calendars you see, I wasn't prepared for it. When we came around a vista and we parked the car and I walked to the edge and I saw it, that part of this 240-mile long the expanse that is, I started to cry. I said to my husband, I need a moment. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. So this in the United States, any of the national parks are gems, gems. When you're able to go overseas and you can go to places like Venice. I mean, I'd heard about that all my life, but then I was invited to the Venice Biennale a few years ago. And you know, you're not allowed to have a vehicle there. And you take the plane and then you take a little bus and you come to the roundabout and you get off with your little suitcase that hopefully someone told you to put on wheels, and you come over the footbridge. And I stopped in my tracks looking at this ancient, stunning vista. And I just turned to David and said, are you kidding me? And all of my preconceived notions of I got to see this, and I'd done my photos guide and my Lonely Planet guide, and I had this list of all these things I was going to see, and that just went right out the window because I knew immediately I was going to be back. So we spent the next 8 days just walking and allowing ourselves to get lost.
Wow.
There's Paris. This world is an extraordinary world. So, and then there's New York City. You know, I have my own Vanessa Hoheb behind the scenes tour of Lower Manhattan that I do for overseas visitors. I love New York City. So Boston, so.
It's what you make of it.
Well, there's also, again, there's a reason that these wonderful historical places, it also depends on what you're interested. If it's in nature and then Acadia National Park, the Pacific Coast Highway, Alaska. We've got a lifetime of exploring to do. So anytime you have the opportunity to travel, anytime, do it.
Yep.
Robado de Misteri. Steal the mysteries.
Thank you for talking about it. Yeah.
Good. Well, I think you need to go out there and kick ass and support each other and be loud when you need to and let other people fight when they need to and do the good work and just take advantage of this wonderful time in your life. Aside from the nightmare that's going on, this will pass.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you're smart and you stay healthy, you'll get through this. Help your families get through this. This will pass. And again, thank you for spending this time with me because I feel like $1 million right now.
Yeah.
Oh.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. It's
Good.
been you're
Thank you for your
our
time.
first speaker. I think it's gone great in my opinion. It's unfortunate Ed wasn't here. I think he would have had a blast and we would have gone another hour or two over for sure.
Yeah.
But you know, I
Well,
think
it's recorded, so he'll get to see it, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Good,
And
good.
we'll reach out to you about the recording as well if you want it.
I
for
do.
you
When there's
to
a link, then send it to me because
yeah.
I want to show it to some of my pals.
Yeah, I didn't see you mentioned, did you say your sister or your sister-in-law trying to join?
No, but I didn't allow myself to be I gave her the capping thing. She said they were using the password. And so would her image have come up if she was able to?
Yeah, she would have popped up and I would have let you know.
I'll
But
send her
so we can make sure she can get a copy too and you can share it with people.
That's great. Thank you for that.
So we'll be reaching out to Ed about that as well. I think it was a really great experience. We got lots of knowledge. And I think everyone was really interested. And I had a great time myself. So thank you so much for coming to speak with us.
You're welcome.
And thank you everyone for coming. People from Capping and outside of Capping. I don't know if there's any stragglers left behind, but we had some other students who showed an interest who popped in. So that's it for today. And then, we'll, if you guys want Vanessa's email or any information, you can reach out to Alicia or me or Alice as well, or even Ed.
Oh, before I forget, put this in your notes. If you're not already aware of the New York Foundation for the Arts, NYFA, they have a tremendous resource on their website called their classifieds. And it's very much, they've really got their finger on the pulse of opportunities. They update it every day in terms of studio assistants, internships. It's primarily East Coast based, New York, Brooklyn, Jersey. There's sometimes opportunities on the West Coast. It's free, and it's a really good resource. The New York Foundation for the Arts, the NYFA classified website. And the other thing is, if you don't already have an Instagram account, I can't imagine you not, but I've found that to be a tremendous tool, particularly now, to find out who's doing what and who's going where and what's happening. And I found that to be a source of comfort in these trying times. So those are two things I wanted to share with you. I forgot. Good.
So you guys can head off now, or say bye, or if you have a last minute question that popped up in your head. I'm glad everyone showed up. It was really great to see everyone virtually.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Go. Be well.
Thank
All
you.
right.
It was a pleasure getting to listen to you. Have a wonderful
Thank
day.
you so much. All right.
Stay
Bye.
well.
Bye, guys. All
Vanessa.
right, and then there were 3.
Oh, I just have a question.
Oh, sure.
If you need any help if you want to set up more Zoom calls in the future and you need like somebody to help, I'm totally willing and able to help you. If you need to, also, is it okay if we send your email out to the class?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you. Yeah, I need all the help I can get. This is all very new to me, and it worked okay.
Yeah.
This worked okay. Yeah. So.
And do you have any suggestions for us in terms of setting this up that you would want us to do differently in the future?
No, I thought this was delicious. You were right on time. It was really nice to see everybody. It felt comfortable to me. The thing I think I'd like to learn, I'd like to learn to do my own PowerPoint so that I can move the images along at my own pacing. And I think that might be a function of my my Wi-Fi connection capability. So the last 2 or 3 times I've done this, I've allowed the host to do that because I didn't want to find out the hard way that I was in some other zone. So is there a simple way I can find out if I have that capability? Like, do I do this with my son or test it out on some willing subject?
I had to teach my mom. My mom's a math teacher, and so when they went online, she had a really hard time like going from the classroom to teaching from our kitchen. So she just Zoomed me, and we just like went through all of the different all the different things. So when you're a host, Sarah, is she a co-host on this? Do you know?
Let me make you a co-host right now.
Sarah's gonna make you a co-host, and we can like
upgraded.
Show you.
You're now a
We
co-host.
can show you the little like tools you have. So on the bottom of your screen, there's a green button that says screen share.
Yep.
And that will allow you to open I'm gonna just share what's on my hard drive right now.
I see it, and it says PowerPoint.
Yeah. So if you click your PowerPoint and then click share, now you can go through your PowerPoint while sharing the screen.
Okay, I just came to a different page. Back to, let's see. It took me away from that page. Let me,
I think that's the tricky thing too, because if you have multiple things open on your laptop and then you share the screen, that's something
I see.
Getting cut
That's
off.
exactly what it was. I had the PowerPoint up on another screen. The screen sharing has stopped as the shared window is closed. So let me get rid of this dialog box.
Okay. And so the easiest way to screen share is to have the tabs you want to share open as separate tabs. So have your PowerPoint on have your PowerPoint on tab, and then you can just click that. The only thing is you can't click off it once you click on it, like they won't see the screen you're sharing after that.
Okay, so I'm going to open that and then minimize that and then drag it over. You won't have to drag it over there. I can leave it over there. Right, so now I see our view, and then if I go to screen share, so now it's open in a separate tab.
I'm going to just stop recording.
Okay, and then